Behind the mask of piety lies a web of deceit and walking contradiction, uncovering the true story of Abdel Hameed Shehadeh, the self-proclaimed Salafi and convicted terrorist. Who is Abdel Hameed Shehadeh, the charlatan who cloaks himself in the guise of Salafi piety while his actions tell a story of deceit and betrayal? Convicted of terrorism in 2013, Shehadeh claims to represent the Salafi Dawah, yet his extremist past, fabricated identity, and documented cooperation with federal authorities paint a far darker picture. From his false lineage, claims to his attempts to mislead both Muslims and law enforcement, Shehadeh emerges as a figure whose duplicity poses a grave threat to the integrity of any Muslim community. Abdel Hameed Shehadeh, a convicted terrorist claiming to follow the Salafi methodology and associate with the Salafi community in New York and beyond, has a highly controversial and deceitful history. Despite alleging Palestinian heritage, his lineage is predominantly Central American, with minimal Palestinian roots. Convicted in 2013 on terrorism charges, Shehadeh's extremist tendencies reportedly surpass those of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Following his conviction, he attempted to reduce his 13-year sentence by providing information to federal authorities, emulating convicted terrorist Jesse Morton's strategy. However, his information was deemed unreliable, and his cooperation efforts failed. During his incarceration, Shehadeh's possession of federal memos detailing counter-extremism strategies exposed his informant activities, leading him to seek refuge in solitary confinement to avoid retaliation from fellow inmates. His inconsistent Islamic practice, documented gambling and pornography addiction, and dubious claims of affiliation with the Salafi community raised significant doubts about his credibility. The Salafi community, committed to authenticity and scholarship, views his association as a potential threat to its integrity and reputation. The following is a report done by a member of the Salafi community who had heard Abdel Hameed Shehadeh try to penetrate and claim belonging to. After doing some investigation and getting in contact with Abdel Hameed's inmates, one of whom was already released, he wrote the following on his X account, formerly known as Twitter, on January 24, 2024. And we quote,
"Who is informant Abdel Hameed Shehadeh, who claims to be on Salafi methodology and a member of the Salafi community in New York and elsewhere? To start off, I confirm that I follow Salafi Manhaj, and I only take from ulama like Sheikh bin Baz, Ibn Uthaymeen, Albani, Fawzan and their students and followers in the West, and I'm against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, and all the deviants and Khawarij. This is my disclaimer so that none of the Khawarij will use this. At the same time, allowing people like Abdel Hameed Shehadeh to speak as if they are representing Salafi Dawah is extremely dangerous. I will be brief here, but I will follow up with more details in the future, Allah willing. Abdel Hameed Shehadeh is a convicted terrorist. He's not Palestinian as he alleges. His father is from Central America and his mother is 25% Palestinian. He was convicted in the U.S. federal courts in 2013 on terrorism charges, and those who know him know he is more extreme than ISIS and Qaeda combined. After Shehadeh was convicted, he wasn't man enough to handle the 13-year prison sentence imposed on him, which he brought upon himself. He immediately began to write to the feds seeking a 5K1 motion in order to fool them about having information on other Muslims that may help reduce his sentence. He learned this from his fellow friend Jesse Morton, who was convicted of terrorism as well and who was with him in prison at the same time, and a close friend prior to that. Jesse Morton succeeded in convincing the feds to lower his sentence in exchange for information he had and to cooperate with them to combat terrorism and fight extremism after his release. One of the biggest tasks delegated to him after his release was an attempt to entrap Musa Tarantonio. The feds tricked Shehadeh by taking all his information, and then they claimed it was not substantial for an early release, nor did they trust him enough to let him work with them after prison. Shehadeh had tens of meetings pleading with the feds, trying to convince them to no avail. Towards the final years of his sentence, in 2020 and after, Shehadeh filed a handwritten motion to a federal judge begging him for an early release due to COVID spreading in his prison, and also stating that he is a changed man who is no longer an extremist or a terrorist. The judge didn't buy it. But since it was getting close to his release date, the feds began to visit him weekly, and sometimes twice a week, recruiting him and discussing with him what he can do for them when he is released. While at McKean Federal Correctional Institution, after returning from a visit with the feds, Shehadeh forgot to lock a big stack of documents in his locker and left it on his cell desk that he brought with him from that visit. A Muslim inmate and a former friend of Shehadeh informed the emir and other inmates of his find. The documents were confidential federal memos directing him on how to combat extremism and how to warn from ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, AAA, and Ahmed Jibril. Inmates in prison have a policy of not dealing with the feds or snitching, no matter what the disagreement is about. When the Muslims questioned him, he waited for the afternoon lockdown for head count and checked himself into the solitary special housing unit to avoid being harmed by the Muslim inmates who don't tolerate informants or snitching. It's important to note Shehadeh may be a wholehearted informant who truly believes his past as a terrorist was wrong, and now he's helping the feds to recompense for his wrongdoing. From his history, it's most likely more certain that he's misleading the feds, reminiscent of how he tried to deceive them in 2010 prior to his arrest when he knew he was under the watch of the FBI. He went to the Army recruiting center in Times Square thinking he could fool the military and the feds into joining them with the plan of deserting once he reaches Iraq, then killing U.S. military servicemen. Either way, he is without a doubt an informant, and the Salafi community does not need such people who will end up detrimental to the Salafi Dawah. The Salafi brothers don't need to place themselves under the radar of the FBI by association with this terrorist. Every prison he served time at, he was either beaten unconscious by the Muslims in order to take him off the compound, or he willingly checked into the solitary unit to avoid being harmed because he was working with the BOP staff, the feds, giving them information on both Muslim and non-Muslim inmates. If you have friends or relatives in any of the federal prisons he served time at, they will testify to the truthfulness of this matter. In the short periods where he served time in the general population, he was a known gambler, porn addict. He was on the daily pill line receiving psychotropic medication. Rarely was he ever seen making prayer, and rarely did he ever attend prayer with the inmates. His porn addiction was so bad it was documented in some of the federal court filings in 2010, even when he was a supposed jihadist. Just as he lies about nearly everything he utters, he lies about his lineage being from Palestine. He lies about being a member of the Salafi community in Brooklyn and elsewhere. I asked Shehadeh on his X account for a single person who would testify to his credibility and about being a member of any Salafi community he claims to be part of, and he couldn't even mention a single individual. I did my own research, which is why I decided to write this, and I asked many brothers and students of the big students of knowledge that I know in his local area. They all advised me to stay away from him. Some said things didn't add up with him, and the majority knew he was an informant for the feds. Salafi Manhaj in the USA and in the UK does not need such characters that will end up harming the path. We have the best students of knowledge and others who are on the Salafi Manhaj all their lives who can warn and expose ISIS, Al-Qaeda, AAA, and Jibril the proper way. I will post part 2 with more proofs, details, and testimony." Unquote. Mudathir Muhammad, January 25, 2024.
Abdel Hameed Shehadeh, self-identified as following the Salafi Manhaj, claims to belong to the Salafi community in Brooklyn, New York, and beyond. However, his lineage and affiliations have been disputed. Despite asserting Palestinian heritage, sources reveal that his father hails from Central America, and his mother is only partially Palestinian. Convicted in 2013 on terrorism charges, Shehadeh allegedly attempted to portray himself as a legitimate representative of Salafi Islam, despite a history of extremism exceeding that of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Following his conviction, Shehadeh received a 13-year federal prison sentence. Unable to cope with incarceration, he began seeking ways to reduce his sentence, inspired by his associate Jesse Morton, another convicted terrorist turned informant. While Morton successfully collaborated with authorities to reduce his sentence and worked to combat terrorism post-release, Shehadeh's attempts were reportedly unsuccessful. Federal authorities deemed his information unreliable and refused to grant him early release. Even with all the snitching, cooperating, and trying to pin false terrorism charges on others to get reduced sentencing, it worked to no avail. He was used and disposed of back to his cell. Only this time, other inmates knew of this snitching. As the famous saying goes, snitches get stitches. Wherever Abdel Hameed was stationed, once the Muslim inmates knew of his snitching history, they would give him a pounding of a lifetime. This was the reason he would request special housing unit so as to avoid the general Muslim population. After being released from serving his sentencing, Abdel Hameed has denied he turned on his friends and informed to the FBI to get reduced sentencing. However, on this daily news article, which was written by John Marzulli, who was present at his trial, it exposes the depth of his treachery of snitching on his own friends and even those whom he barely knew. John Marzulli states that during interrogation, he was shown over 40 photographs and named various individuals from New York and Hawaii. It included educators and students to speakers and activists, as well as military personnel. He identified a Brooklyn teachers associated with Salafism, a College of Staten Island student at a terrorist fundraiser, and others. He also identified individuals who gave pro-jihadist speeches at mosques or were active in online chat rooms promoting jihadist ideology. He also mentioned an Ethiopian Muslim in the U.S. Army. Imagine pinning all these various individuals who were once his friend to be incriminated just so he can get reduced sentencing. Shehadeh's cooperation led to a 22-page FBI report detailing his claims, which his lawyer is now seeking to suppress, arguing that Shehadeh was coerced into waiving his rights against self-incrimination. Shehadeh himself confessed to potentially incriminating himself during questioning. A psychiatric evaluation revealed that Shehadeh struggled with core confusion and insecurity. Here we present part of the transcript of the psychiatric evaluation.
The last time I met with Mr. Shehadeh, however, his attitude swings had settled, perhaps because of the unexpected consequences of his imprisonment. It is possible that the structure of the prison has helped Mr. Shehadeh settle down his overly emotional responses to his changing environment, which in the past disturbed his core belief system, so that he could not calmly find his own path through a chaotic world. I am speculating, of course, but there is some evidence that the prison, while depressing, has been an educational experience, and one that has allowed and encouraged him to mature more normally than he was in the past. Therefore, I considered it a good sign that recently he has been more depressed than he appeared in the prior interviews. He is being realistic now, and he is assessing things rationally now. In fact, questioned about his religion, he has admitted to be an agnostic, able to consider different possibilities without extremism. At the same time, he had, up until our last meeting, a grossly unrealistic idea about his own place in the world, evidenced by his belief that he might one day win the Nobel Prize for peace. Although he had not been able to earn an undergraduate degree, he frequently resorted to the use of platitudes to explain his unrealistic thinking and expectations. This is not necessarily a sign of dishonesty, but rather a sign of his remarkable immaturity. Someone who is a devout Muslim on Monday and a born-again Christian on Thursday, who mentally flies from pillar to post without any grounded internal persona, might be best described as a flake. The impression that I gained from speaking with Mr. Shehadeh, even including this test results, is that he feels passionately about things that he does not think clearly about. Obviously, from his history of embracing first Islam, and then born-again Christianity, and back and forth again, as he has done while incarcerated, and from his often bewildering responses to repeated questioning by the FBI, it is hard to form a clear opinion about what Shehadeh ever thought, feels, and/or remembers. Unless he is spectacularly intelligent and devilishly manipulative, his underlying problem would appear to be his own insecurity, and what I might call core confusion. He seemed to be outwardly giving the impression that he felt sure of himself with each change of attitude, rather like an adolescent who falls in love with every girl who smiles at him, but who cannot remember the last one's name. But, extending this simile, he was never like a deliberate Don Juan, who wanted to love him and leave him. Rather, he was genuinely swept away, and then swept a different way. Because of my uncertainty about the precise nature of Mr. Shehadeh's charges, I did not probe extensively into this subject. Still, we spoke about his recent and past history. Mr. Shehadeh revealed that he had an unpleasant childhood and was often beaten up by his elder brother. He related that he had turned to religion during adolescence in order to find some meaning in life, and that he settled upon Islam. You asked that I assess Mr. Shehadeh's mental state. The psychiatric issues in his case appear relatively straightforward. First, given his unusual claim to the effect that he was working undercover for some clandestine governmental agency, is he likely to be delusional, or is he largely free from serious psychiatric illness? Second, can one predict, on the basis of the psychological testing or from any other mental state information, whether Mr. Shehadeh is apt to be dangerous in the future? Third, are there additional psychiatric issues that should be considered at sentencing? Confusion both on his part, indeed he admits confusion repeatedly, and even perhaps on the part of the agents interviewing him. It is clear that the agents in Hawaii did give him assignments and that, in some manner, he performed them. It is not clear how much and/or what kind of remuneration he received for the performance of these services. Neither he nor the FBI agents have been very clear about this issue. It does seem, however, that he lived essentially rent-free for about a year in Hawaii and did not suffer serious privation, although it did not appear that he was ever gainfully employed, except perhaps for the services he was performing for the Bureau's agents.
Abdel Hameed Shehadeh's psychiatric evaluation reveals a man grappling with core confusion and insecurity, evidenced by his fluctuating religious beliefs from Islam to Christianity to agnosticism. His aspirations, like winning the Nobel Peace Prize without an undergraduate degree, highlight a significant disconnect from reality, pointing to immaturity rather than cunning manipulation. His time in prison appears to have provided some structure, possibly aiding in stabilizing his previously volatile emotional responses and belief systems. His recent acknowledgement of agnosticism and signs of depression might indicate a more realistic self-assessment, though his past involvement with the FBI in Hawaii remains ambiguously defined, contributing to the confusion around his motives and mental state. The evaluation suggests that Shehadeh's passionate but unclear thinking stems from emotional immaturity and insecurity, not from deliberate deceit. His troubled childhood, where he turned to religion for meaning, might have set the stage for his later identity crises. While he shows signs of personal growth, the lack of clarity in his past activities with law enforcement complicates assessments of his mental health and potential risk. His case calls for a careful consideration in legal and psychiatric contexts, focusing on understanding his psychological journey and potential for rehabilitation. Shehadeh's narrative is riddled with contradictions. One of Shehadeh's co-defendants that testified against him reported that Shehadeh intended to join the military for jihad purposes. However, during his enlistment process, when he went to an army recruitment office, he presented himself as a loyal citizen with limited travel history, omitting visits to Pakistan and claiming he only traveled outside of America once, to Israel. Shehadeh initially claimed direct communication with al-Awlaki, only to later state he never received responses to his emails, claiming that he fought alongside Hamas in 2003 when he was 13 years old in Mukayyam, Kalandia. When he told authorities he only traveled once to Israel, sounds quite far-fetched and more of an exaggeration to gain what we call street creds. He also claimed he lived in Palestine 2 times over and visited 3 times. However, he told authorities he traveled outside of the United States once, Israel. A U.S. passport holder cannot live in Israel more than 3 months at a time without special permits for Kogat. U.S. citizens who are also on the Palestinian Population Registry for the West Bank can enter Israel visa-free for short-term visits, business, tourism, or transit, up to 90 days under specific conditions outlined in recent agreements. Given his parents' distant status to Palestinian lands, it is unlikely he stayed in Palestine more than 3 months or less under tourism visa while young. He also claimed he attended Al-Nur School, which is a private Islamic school. Yet in his psychiatric evaluation, he states he had turned to Islam in his adolescence. These are part of the many contradictions that Abdel Hameed Shehadeh finds himself drowning in. While he's free to roam from his captivity, he presents himself with a totally different image than what is on paper. One has to wonder how Abdel Hameed Shehadeh is allowed to threaten law enforcement authority without impunity. Unless, of course, there are some hidden elements. In a post on X, formerly known as Twitter, he stated the following. Quote, "I ask Allah with his most perfect names and lofty attributes, the one who avenges the oppressed and subdues the tyrants, to make an example out of Eric Vitaliano, Russ Mochizuki, Edward Panetta, Angel Masonet, Paul Lee, Ali Kazemi, John Tinning, and the rest of the scumbags who aided and abetted their criminal actions. May Allah honor the one who seeks rectification and the Sunnah of the Nabi. Ameen." Unquote. The statement above appears to praise the one who would seek the rectification that is referred to in the tradition of the Prophet. This appears to hint at indirectly asking anyone who can take care, rectification, and honor the person who can take care of those names mentioned. This doesn't appear to be a simple supplication or prayer. It's inferring to a physical act that would honor the one who seeks rectification. Abdel Hameed Shehadeh remains a controversial figure, both for his extremist past and his subsequent role as an informant. His actions, marked by deception and self-interest, have alienated him from various communities, including the Salafi Muslims he claims to represent. Despite his claims of reform, his credibility remains in doubt, with many viewing him as a cautionary tale of extremism and failed redemption. With all the blatant lies, deception, and contradiction that Abdel Hameed expressed in his X account, formerly known as Twitter, It is to be determined whether he has a sudden episodes of dementia or amnesia. Take for example this post where he claims he remembers how many times the car flipped while he was in an accident. It's as if he was counting the number of flips while holding on to dear life. Or it could be that there is something more sinister about his pattern of behavior in complete denial of his past actions. Abdel Hameed Shehadeh is the human embodiment of a plot twist, a man whose behavior oscillates so wildly it could power a metronome. Claiming allegiance to peaceful ideologies while entangled in extremist controversies, preaching reform while undermining his credibility, and shifting from devout faith to agnosticism to ambitions of Nobel recognition, his narrative is one of unrelenting contradiction. Whether driven by manipulation, delusion, or desperation, Shehadeh's story is a masterclass in polarity, leaving both supporters and skeptics grappling to pin down who he really is, or who he wants us to believe he is today.